And then by my late 20s, I'm walking into Premier League clubs. The leaders in the team and teammates helped me to do that.
Yeah.
Bill Shankly helped me to do that kind of thing. I've been lead psychologist for England Golf, England Rugby, worked with about half a dozen Premier League clubs. I've spent the last 2 seasons at Feyenoord. I've been blessed to work alongside Arne for the last 2 seasons. Nobody, I don't think, has a problem these days about, psychology plays a big role. Whether there's a place for a sports psychologist, that's another story.
Gareth Bale said, "Soccer Tough" was the book that changed his life.
What a game face is it is your optimal, your best mental state. It's your competitive persona. It's the persona you need to have in any given moment. You can't 100% control your mind, but you can take control of things that help you manage your mindset. Giving as many people as good a chance as possible to discover just how good that they can be.
Some of the teams you've worked with. Tell us a little bit about Aston Martin.
Sure.
So Dan, thank you for joining me on the Profici Podcast. It's an absolute pleasure, an honour and a pleasure, I must say. We're just going to start off. Let's go back. So tell me a little bit what you were like as a child.
Wow, I wasn't expecting that question.
Yeah.
Fantastic, Andrew. Well, firstly, let me say honour and pleasure to be here with you today. I was introverted, shy. Shyness and introversion isn't the same thing. I think I was a nice child. I was good for my parents because I was well behaved by and large. Changed a little bit in teenage years, but not too much. So I think the three ways I would describe myself would have been introverted, shy, and well behaved.
Nice. So what did you want to be when you were younger?
My first ever ambition was to be a postman.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
Nice.
For some reason, the idea of posting boxes or letters through doors and knocking on, it must have been the influence of Postman Pat.
Yeah.
I used to watch most days after coming home from half a day at school. In my memory, that was the first ambition. It was when I was about 12, 13, I started to play golf. And that the golf took over from the ambition to be a postman. Felt that there were more things I could achieve as a golfer. So throughout most of my teenage years, it was to be a professional golfer.
Okay, so tell us a bit more about the golf.
Took it up far too late.
Right.
I didn't have any familial influence there. Like, my dad was the only London taxi driver not to play golf.
Right.
Literally, I think. And actually, I had 3 uncles who were London taxi drivers, and they didn't play golf either. So really, nobody played golf, and I was always really sporty. And I just watched it on TV one time, and I really want to. It's like mid-80s. I really want to give that a go. So it wasn't until very beginning of the 90s that I actually had a golf lesson, because I played all sports, was involved and with other sports, and so I gave the golf a go, and just fell in love with it. And I wasn't very good. I didn't get better very quickly to begin with. I think my first handicap was 36 that you can have as a junior golfer, and it came down to 32 in a year. So it wasn't as if suddenly I wasn't like Nick Faldo. So Nick Faldo came down to scratch in 2 years, that type of thing. I was probably not particularly good. But then it started to come down, and I just played all the time. And then at 17 years old, I came that year from 2 to scratch. So I was a competent golfer. But the very best amateurs are sort of +4, +5.
Yeah.
And so they're way beyond that. But I announced to my parents that I wanted to be the best golfer in the world. I didn't want to go to university. I was going to give golf a go. And so I gave golf a go. And it didn't go so well. And then I got invited into the pro shop to be an assistant professional. And the head pro said, you go play. I teach, and you go play and do your qualifications to become a PGA qualified coach. And so I played on the mini tours around Great Britain and Europe, and I didn't get very far, but I did okay and nearly qualified for the Open in 1998, but had an appalling score in final qualifying, and so I did all right, and then stopped playing because I realised I wasn't going to quite compete with Tiger Woods, and I valued making some money in life and not eating out of a baked bean tin can for the rest of my life, which I basically was at the time. Yeah. And so that's when I started to coach the game and build things from there.
So how long were you coaching for?
Really, I would say 4 or 5 years, and it was maybe 6. Memory fails me a bit, but once I finished playing, I took up coaching. I was like, right, that's it, I'm going to become a great coach. But as I was coaching, I'd always had an interest in the psychology of golf, and that kind of interest broadened into the psychology of sport. And so I thought, I'm not 100% sure if I want to be a golf coach for the rest of my life. So I'm going to go to university. So as I was coaching the game, and I was working 30, 40 hours a week coaching.
Yeah, it's long hours, isn't it?
Yeah, it's the kind of thing with golf. It's a bit different as a coach. You know, you're not doing it, you can do it part-time, but you're not doing it part-time. You're doing it all day, every day, in the evenings, anti-social hours at the weekends. So I was working long hours there, and then I did my degree in psychology, master's degree in sports psychology, and you know, I came to a crossroads, and that's why I thought, you know what, I want to do psychology. I want to go into other areas as a sports psychologist, other sports. And that's why I decided to walk away from the golf tee, the golf mat as a coach, and go into sports psychology full time.
Was it difficult at the start? Obviously, you've just qualified. You've got this wealth of knowledge that you want to get out there.
Yeah.
How did you start?
Well, I knew, you talk about wealth of knowledge. I mean, I think about what I know now, and hopefully in 20 years' time, I'll look back and think I knew nothing now. When I reflect back then, I didn't know much, but I knew a bit. And I'd always had a really geeky interest. And I think at 15, 16 years old, I picked up Timothy Galway's In a Game of Tennis, and my mother gave me a book when I was about 16 because I think she was a bit concerned that I wasn't going to make it as a golfer, and that was a sports psychology book. So I'd always had a bit of a geeky interest in it. So I was a kind of in my mid-20s, so I knew quite a bit. Not what I know now, but quite a bit. So I was ready, as you say, to sort of disseminate this information, work with athletes. And I approached a non-league football club and said, you know, I'll work for... I actually did charge them a little bit, which I'm quite surprised I did, because by and large at that time I was just saying, I'll work for nothing, just work for nothing and work with you. And that's what I did for quite a long time. So it was a case of, there was just something about... I was never a confident golfer, but it was just something about the experiences I'd had, my geeky tendency to read a lot about sports psychology. Even in my mid-20s, hey, I was ready to go. And I was quite confident, probably overly confident, ridiculously so. And then by my late 20s, I'm walking into Premier League clubs and doing so with quite a stride in my step, which when I look back is, I'm pleased I did that, but I'm, perhaps I didn't deserve to be quite as confident as I was. And that's really how I started.
It's funny though, as you're saying you wasn't the greatest golfer, but then if you look at football, some of the greatest managers haven't been great players, have they? Mm-hmm. Like Mourinho is probably the obvious one, isn't he? I suppose, but you're not having this illustrious golf career, it's made you or enabled you to focus more on the psychology. Whereas I suppose if you're everywhere, here, there and everywhere, you would have had to take it up later in life because you'd have been playing golf everywhere, wouldn't you, really?
I think it's interesting because when you say that, I always think of, again, if I used to use a golf story, I've worked heavily in football, but if I think of golf, I watched the great South African golfer Ernie Els. Do you remember Ernie?
Oh, yeah.
And I think he's now retired, but I watched him give a golf lesson. And it was one of the, with respect to Ernie, incredible golfer and probably a reasonably accomplished coach. But what I watched was pretty poor. It was just like, he was trying to teach something. It was like, how do you do that? It was a lob shot or something. And he just said, well, I just put the club behind the ball like that and I just swing and it just goes up in the air. And it was something like that. I'm perhaps slightly caricaturing that, but it was quite poor. So, yeah, there's look, whether it's ability, physical ability, technical ability in sport, whether it's knowledge, it's such a different thing to possess that knowledge. We in psychology might call that knowledge in the game, knowledge in the game. And it's very different to helping others develop their knowledge in the game and their knowledge of the game. They're really two very different things. The ability to spot that pass, to control the ball, the ability to take the player on. These are separate skills to having the ability to teach somebody how to do that. That doesn't mean there's not some link there. And definitely there can be an advantage if you've played the game because you have those experiences. But just because you have those experiences doesn't mean the person you're coaching will do those things in the same way or have the same lens of the world as you or find what you're saying useful. Coaching in and of itself, helping others, is a skill that has multiple tools, techniques, approaches, concepts, constructs that people need to utilize. So really playing and coaching, there's a small relationship there, but it's far smaller than people realize. Coaching is an art, it's a science, it's a craft.
Yeah. Do you find psychology in sport, or it doesn't matter what sport it is almost becoming more important than it was when you first started?
Yes, it's now it's finding its voice.
Yeah.
People who you would have thought would have remained skeptical are now opening their arms as they open their minds and they want to have conversations. I think it's several things. I think the proliferation of information as a consequence of the internet on society. These days you can go on YouTube, and watch a video, you can buy a book off Amazon really easy, you can click on a blog, you can listen to a podcast. There's so much information available that explains things. And when people explain things in an effective manner, the people who you would have thought would have been slightly skeptical, not cynical, but slightly skeptical about this area, actually, they listen to it, they process it, they think about it, and then they utilise it and become open-minded about utilising it. So I think there's that. I think there's a generational thing as well. You know, I think the last couple of generations now, again, in line with the internet, but just generation now much more in tune with mental health, well-being, much more in tune with perhaps thinking, not being intimidated by thinking about things that underpin performance. So I just think there's multiple things that cook away under the surface that now means that people are much more open. That doesn't mean to suggest as a sports psychologist it's an easy industry to break into or to be involved in, just because psychology is embedded into everything that everybody does. And so you still get, and quite rightly so, you get players who say, I'm just good at this and I don't need to speak to you, which is absolutely fine. You get coaches who say, well, I deliver on the psychology, which I strongly believe is true. So there's kind of a difference between sports psychology and sports psychologist. Nobody, I don't think, has a problem these days about, psychology plays a big role. And people are far more open to having broader and deeper conversations. Whether there's a place for a sports psychologist, that's another story.
It's interesting, actually, because obviously we've just had the pleasure of watching you do a talk, and something that David Fairclough said afterwards, a lot of what you said resonated with him from when he was a player, but back then it wasn't called anything. He said, there was a few methods that Shankly used to use, which he seen things like what you were explaining there, and he sort of associated with it. And it just, I suppose, at that time, they were probably the people who were thought leaders, but maybe they didn't even know it was psychology. It was just like, in a way.
Yeah. Look, I'm not one of these sports psychologists that would come along and say, well, we are the gatekeepers. We're absolutely not. I if you want to label it as old school, I love old school. I love new school. I love every school. I think it all has value. I think I'm a sense maker and a sense giver. So, talking to David Fairclough there, a Liverpool legend, was an honour and a delight for me, and to listen to what he had to say, his stories. And I introduced the audience today to some simple techniques that I utilise with players, and he essentially said, I did that. That's what I did. And the people around me, the leaders in the team and teammates, helped me to do that. And Bill Shankly helped me to do that kind of thing. I had a label for it, a game face, right? So I've put a term to it, and maybe I've put I'm a sense maker and a sense giver. I've put a bit more meat on the bone to it that maybe can be of advantage to some others who might struggle in that area that, David maybe didn't struggle in that area. So it's really collating what we do now, what we've done in the past, adding to it, creating frameworks, tools, techniques around these things, and giving as many people as good a chance as possible to discover just how good that they can be. Because I would always say that there would have, I would respectfully suggest that when David played, there would be other potential David Faircloughs who didn't make the breakthrough for various reasons, one of which might have been they wouldn't have necessarily had the wherewithal around the mental side of the game that he had.
Yeah.
So that's what we've got to remember. If we go back to, the 60s, 70s, 80s, there were players not pushing through because they experienced performance anxiety, because they didn't know how to deal with worry and doubt and stress and frustration and anger. They didn't know how to put themselves into their best mindset on game day. They didn't know how to learn effectively. They didn't necessarily naturally just use their self-talk or their body language. They weren't necessarily around great leaders and teammates. So we do have to remember lots of people drop away. So we need to find as many ways to help as many people as possible to discover just how good they can be.
So you touched on some of the techniques you use. Explain a little bit in detail about some of your techniques which you like to use.
Yeah, well, I'll talk to you about the technique I spoke to the audience today, because I think it is a technique that's quite robust. It can be utilised in a sporting context. It can be utilised in a corporate environment. I built it. I'm standing on the shoulders of giants, so I built it from the work of lots of research scientists, psychologists. But it's a technique I call a game face. Which is obviously a popular term out there, and it's that classic get your game face on, but it's more than a face. It's from your head to your feet to your head, and out into your space. What a game face is it is your optimal, your best mental state. It's your competitive persona. It's the persona you need to have in any given moment, whether that's a game of football, a game of golf, a tennis match, whether it's a facilitation of a meeting, a tough conversation with a client, a sales call. Again, it can be used across a number of contexts. It's a behavioural blueprint. It's an attitudinal guide. It's a physical optimizer for sports people. I'll give you an example of a game face. There's a very famous footballer that I've worked with who has a game face of dominant and relentless, dominant and relentless, dominant and relentless. And every single day he pictures, images, mentally rehearses in his mind what it is to be dominant and relentless in his role. He happens to be a defender. And every single day he weaves a story in his mind of, my job on the pitch is to be dominant and relentless. I'm going to be dominant and relentless non-stop. Nothing and no one takes me away from dominant and relentless. Every run, every movement, every action. If we go a goal down, dominant and relentless. If I miss a chance to score, dominant and relentless. If my cross goes into row Z, dominant and relentless. If I make a mistake, dominant and relentless. If I'm playing a great opposing player, dominant and relentless. Nothing and no one takes me away from dominant and relentless. His game face is dominant and relentless. And rather than going into the game thinking, got to win, got to win, got to win, got to perform, got to perform, got to perform. That might be a part of his narrative of wanting to win, wanting to perform well. And we'd never want to take those things away from a player. We broke that down to the kind of behavioural attributes that he had to execute, and one of which was, I'm going to execute every action, because football, this is about football. Football is just a bunch of actions. It's physical actions, it's technical actions, it's tactical actions. I'm just going to execute those actions, dominant and relentless. Dominant and relentless is his game face. So 2 action words. How did we come up with that? I tapped into his memory, his imagination, his perception. Okay. Memory being, when I sat down with him, because he was suffering from a bit of performance anxiety. Okay. He had just broken into the team. It's a big team. And he wanted to stay there. He didn't want to make mistakes. He had a few negative thoughts, emotions, feelings running through his head and his body when he made mistakes. He was a bit worried about getting dropped. He was worried about what the gaffer thought of him. So we needed to turn his attention onto something positive. And we needed to squash those negative thoughts. I call those negative thoughts ants, A-N-T-S, automatic negative thoughts. So we needed to squash those ants. And so we created this game face by helping him tap into, number one, his memory. Tell me about you at your best. Tell me about you at your best. So he had to think about that. And he started to talk to me about a best game. And he ran me through that. And then we tapped into his imagination. I said, I want you to imagine that you go out the weekend, you play your dream game. So memory from the past, imagination into the future. Tell me about your dream game. So he talked to me about that. And it was quite a strong relationship to his memory, his best game. And then we tapped into his perception. What kind of player do you need to be out there? How do you perceive yourself out there? Who do you need to be? So we were talking about this for a good half an hour and coming up with, and I put a bunch of words in front of him, a bunch of action-based words. Action-based words are very, very powerful. They are adjectives, and adjectives change nouns. When we think of adjectives, we think of action-based words that can change behaviour. And he was looking down these words, and there's things like alert, alive, lively, relentless, positive, calm, relaxed. He came dominant, relentless, dominant, relentless. So we unpacked dominant, relentless, which was related to his best game, his dream game, his perception of who he needed to be out there. And so dominant, relentless became his game face, and every day dominant, relentless. And it's just a great way. So such a useful way to create great pictures that drive great feelings going into a game. It's a great way to help players shift their attention away from got to perform, got to win. Those are the catalysts of performance anxiety, or tend to be. And it's a fast-acting tool that a player can use out on the pitch when they need it, especially if they suddenly have an automatic negative thought, and they can squash that quickly by coming back to their game face. Dominant and relentless, dominant and relentless. And anybody can use this in any one of their performance moments. And I'm here today because I introduced this to your audience. I said, look, a footballer can do this, a golfer can do this, a tennis player can do this, but you can do this in your performance moment. And your performance moments in the corporate environment, in the workplace, come thick and fast. That sales call, that presentation, that facilitation, all these things 10, 12 times a day. If you can have a game face for these moments, and that game face might change depending on the performance moment. If you can have a game face, a descriptor of who you need to be, okay, your authentic self in that specific context, then that's a very powerful thing to have.
Suppose in a way it's a bit like controlling the controllables, isn't it? Your mindset is really the only thing that you can control. In a game, say a game of football, there's that many variables, as you say. You can't. So what's the point in worrying over them? Because you can't control that. All you can control is your own.
You are right. It's a game of self-control. I think control is a very good word. I think there's two things to say to what you've said. It's really interesting when you have these conversations, because as you said there, and it's in the one part a flippant remark from you, and another part it's not, because it's deep and meaningful. It's just, well, what's the point in thinking about these things? And it's interesting because you're quite right to say that. What is the point in worrying about outcome and performance? Because you certainly can't control outcome. You can argue that you can influence performance, but it's then, well, how do I do that? You come back to what you can control. What I think we can safely say there's lots of things we don't know about the human brain and nervous system, but what we can safely say is the brain tends to be quite judgmental. It's a survival mechanism. It's, we're designed to try to get along and get ahead. We're designed to judge what's going on around us so we feel secure and safe in our world. And so when we're playing a game of football, when we're in a tough conversation and our brain is attuned to survival, it can tend to send us alerts, that fight, flight, freeze type scenario. And that can tend to happen. So we need something to deal with that. And that judgment, it tends to be based around, how am I doing here? How am I doing with relation to the outcome I want? How am I doing with my performance? We tend as human beings to feel we're being judged. Most of our anxiety is around social anxiety. So all these brain mechanisms kind of tend to underpin the fact that we have a brain that orients towards outcome and performance. So we need tools and techniques to bring us back to that process, that mindset process. Now, one more thing to say about what you said there. Again, I completely agree with you, but control is a very strong word. I always say to clients, look, actually, you can't 100% control your mind, but you can take control of things that help you manage your mindset. Like if we think about, and if we put it in very simple terms, thoughts, emotions, feelings inside of us. Thoughts, emotions, feelings tend to emerge. They happen to us. We can certainly generate a thought. It's difficult to generate an emotion. It's difficult to generate a feeling. We can generate a thought, but in broad terms, thoughts, emotions, feelings in any given scenario, in any given context, happen to us. And lots of those thoughts, emotions, feelings aren't necessarily helpful. So I would stop at saying, maybe we can't completely control your thoughts, your attitude, your energy all of the time. But what we can do is respond to what we're experiencing inside. And that's, for example, well, I want this footballer to respond dominant and relentless in their game face. We can respond to our inner world in an appropriate manner.
So moving on to some of the teams you've worked with. Tell us a little bit about Aston Martin.
Sure. I'll certainly share with you what I can share. I was blessed to be asked to be involved with Aston Martin the beginning of 2023. They're certainly a team striving to be on the up. Their results have gone better the last couple of years. It's a tough tough environment, Formula One. I was very much invited in to strive to help the pit crew. Which was brilliant. I love it. It's such a challenge. You think about the pit crew. I mean, their job is far broader, far deeper, far bigger than, the pit stop that you see. They're all mechanics, very accomplished mechanics who work hard on the car, who have to team together, lead, who have to lead upwards and lead downwards. So there's a strong psychosocial dynamic to everything that they do every single day. But certainly where we started was the consistency of the pit stop. So tools like a game face are the kind of things I may have introduced to them in the last couple of years that we've worked on, just to help them deal with that performance moment that they have, which is the nerve-wracking, the call that the car is going to come in, and then all of a sudden, you have a physiological response because you make a small mistake, and you could cost the driver the race, and they can be quite unforgiving. You can cost the company a lot of money. We've seen those images where somebody's put the spanner in the wrong place or just pressed something and suddenly the car's got a dent. I mean, it's so fragile. So, of course, these are people who need performance tools in order to manage themselves in their performance moment so much better. As a sports psychologist, that's what they brought me in to do.
Right. Other teams you've worked with?
So I work, I've been lead psychologist for England Golf, England Rugby, going into 2019 World Cup. I've worked with about half a dozen Premier League clubs. I suppose most topical, and I respectfully can't speak too much about the ins and outs of my work with this team, but I've spent the last 2 seasons at Feyenoord Football Club. And whilst many people might not necessarily, ardent football fans will know of Feyenoord. They're a big Dutch European team, but maybe some people haven't heard of, but might have now, because Jurgen Klopp has left Liverpool and the head coach at Feyenoord is now becoming the head coach at Liverpool. Starts in a few days' time. That's Arne Slot, and I've been blessed to work alongside Arne for the last 2 seasons, helping him on what I would describe as high performance mindset, so helping players find their high performance mindset. So I've been working behind the scenes there, and I'm always passionate about working with and through coaches, making sure that the players themselves understand that they're the most powerful psychologists. You know, if they become great leaders, if they become great teammates, they're the most powerful psychologists for themselves in many respects. So that's the way I try to work with organisations, with sporting organisations. I always say 2 things really. I'm in row Z. And I'm the kind of 1% guy, or even 0.01% guy. I'm, none of the results are really heavily influenced by me. That's not to suggest that I don't have an influence, but and the other thing to say is, as I said, I will often work with and through coaches. So that's what I've been doing quite a lot with the Feyenoord coaches.
Okay. So, looking at challenges, what would you say the most common challenges that athletes face when it comes to mental challenges, really?
It's a really, really good question. I don't think I can pinpoint one. I mean, I think the most obvious one is, I think there's 3 or 4, maybe 5. Performance anxiety is obviously massive, especially in adult elite sport, professional sport. There's some people, without a shadow of a doubt, who have so much skill in their feet or in their hands, it doesn't really matter how they think. They kind of can just get away with it most of the time. But the vast majority of players do succumb to a form of pressure some of the time. So I'm passionate about players having simple mental frameworks for the mental side of their game, for the performance side of their game. So I think performance anxiety is a massive one, and using a tool, a technique like a game face can help them in that kind of thing. There's a range of tools that you can use. I would also say what's kind of not spoken enough about, but is starting to get more airtime in my world, is the ability to learn. I think football can be a real guilty environment in terms of this player's got it, hasn't got it. Can't teach an old dog new tricks, and by the time players get into their 20s, well, he's not going to make a change, or she's not going to make a change there. I'm passionate about upskilling coaches to make sure they understand how human beings best learn in activities, in sessions, every single day. So I think as a sports psychologist, I take a broad definition of psychology, and I think human learning is a part of that. So I think, number one, performance anxiety. I think the capacity to learn is really, really important. And I think the best players, more often than not, learn better than those who aren't quite as good as them. I think leadership and teamwork is absolutely imperative. And again, I think that this is an area that can be done so much better in sport. Being less scared about, I think there's a fear in sport, again, if I may say, especially football, where, well, we don't want the players to think too much about this. We don't want them to overthink. We don't want to give them too much here. And what tends to suffer is the ability to upskill leadership, is the ability to develop great teammates. It's kind of, he's a leader or he's not. She's a leader or she's not. That player is a great teammate, or that player isn't a great teammate. They just get on with it themselves. They're an individual. And I think historically, in my humble opinion, there's been a fear of developing these for the fear of confusing or overloading players. So I think I'd put teamwork and team and leadership next. I think the next one would be mental health and well-being. Making sure these are very high pressured environment. Again, if we're talking about the professional and the developing elite, the developing professional environment, these are high pressured environments where you feel very judged. That's not to suggest that you don't feel judged in the workplace. It doesn't suggest that being a lawyer, or definitely being a doctor, or being, every work has every workplace and every profession has their pressures. Okay. In sport, there's something very overt about performance, because in the professional game, you're being watched, you're being judged all the time, whether that's judgment to get into the team, whether it's judgment from fans. So there's that element that really can turn up the volume of stress and anxiety. And so having sophisticated tools and techniques that players can utilize every single day for rest and recuperation, for mental well-being, and for limiting mental ill health, for me, is absolutely imperative. So I think 4 things there: performance anxiety, leadership and teamwork, learning, mental health and well-being, and I suppose the 5th one, which goes in line with the first one, is just being a great competitor. And again, I think if the sport is guilty of doing something, competition, the ability to be a great competitor, relies on the skill of somebody in somebody's hands or in somebody's feet. And when they're skillful, they're great competitors. That tends to be the equation. And somebody like myself comes along and goes, well, yeah, let's develop skill. Let's help them learn. Let's make sure they're mentally healthy and have experienced a great deal of well-being. If they can be leaders and teammates, great. If they can deal with performance anxiety, even better. Now, if we can add a dollop of sophisticated competitiveness, the ability to compete, the ability to get into the right mental state, and if I'm not in the right mental state, to get the best from the game I've got on the day. That's what it is to be a great competitor. To me, a great competitor is someone who high performs consistently under pressure. And it's more than just the skill in your feet, and it's more than just dealing with performance anxiety. It's getting into the right mental state and staying there. And it's dealing with the bad days better. That's what it is to be a great competitor. So those 5 areas are crucial.
It leads me on to the next question, really. I think something I've seen, a couple of interviews I've watched, and be interesting to see what your point of this is. So if you walk into a team or a squad of players, the ones who are almost elite or on the next level, would you say a lot of that is attributed to mindset? Going back to, say, interviews I've seen with Steven Gerrard, Stephen Hendry, people like that, said it was just, they almost had to become so selfish and so like, I have to be the best. That's what made them the best as out of a squad of players. Can you see that when you walk into a room of players yourself or into a squad?
Look, I think it's a really good question. I think the popular reply would be, yeah, you can. And I think it's really complex now. I'm going to be a real psychologist now and just say, and complexify it and just say, I think it's really, I'm always a bit skeptical when somebody says, oh, this game is 80% mental and stuff like that. And actually my own sport of golf, I think we've got to a point now, if you go on Amazon and you type in golf psychology, and I include one of my books is on golf psychology, you're flooded with so many books. But the reality is that, you know, if I take golf is what the ball does. What the ball does is determined by what the club tells it to do. What the club tells it to do is a lot to do with what your hands, arms and body is doing. Now, definitely the mind, the nervous system plays a big part in what the body is doing, but you've got to coordinate your body. There are just some players in golf who are just so good. Rory, playing off +5 when he's 15. Brooks Koepka, Tiger, Seve, all the best players tend to be, with the greatest respect, just very, very, very good. Now, again, let's complexify it further. Every sport is different. So the dynamic of golf could be, well, I can't strike a golf ball like Brooks Koepka, or I can't strike a golf ball like Rory or Tiger Woods or Scotty Scheffler, but I have something about me, a competitive skill, an ability to deal with performance anxiety, a selfishness with my practice or something like that, or certain things that enable me to get the most from the game that I have. So I might not be the best ball striker. I can't send it 350 yards down the fairway, but I can knock it out there 280, 300, and then I'm a great putter. and then I've got nerves of steel in and around the green. So the dynamic of sport, every sport is different, and their dynamic is really important. So we can say, for example, let's go back to Steven Gerrard. I don't know Steven, and he's one of the greatest Premier League midfielders. We can say he is brilliant mentally, and I'm sure he was, but the reality is, as a midfielder, he's still got to have the ability to get around the pitch. And this is and this is where I have to be very careful as a sports psychologist, because as a sports psychologist, I can tend to see the lens of the world through psychology. It's like if everything is shaped as if I only ever have a hammer, I won't butcher this. If I only have a hammer as a tool, everything is shaped as a nail. So I think, well, it's all psychology. It's 80% psychology. It's all psychology. Gerrard is Gerrard, or Gerrard was Gerrard because of his psychological attributes. Well, hang on. And coaches will say to me, I remember asking one coach, who was the best player? He'd played Premier League. Who was the best player you ever played against? He said, he didn't even blink. He said, Gareth Barry. And that might not be the most popular answer that someone can give you. And Gareth Barry was a wonderful player. But I said, well, why? And he said, because he was 2-3 steps ahead. And he was just on you straight away. It was just, I heard somebody speak the other day about Wayne Rooney. And we think about Wayne Rooney's sublime skills, but that person said he was quicker than Michael Owen. He felt that Rooney, rightly or wrongly, was quick. He was on you in a second. Great players can get around the pitch. Great players have physical attributes. Great players can tend to be very, very skillful. So we've got to be careful if we just say, oh, it's mindset. However, to then argue back on myself, how are we defining mindset? Because a big part of mindset could be the perceptual cognitive side of the game. That's my psychological posh term for game intelligence, the ability to be aware, to perception action, to see and do, to search, decide, execute. And again, some players just have the ability to do that. Some players learn how to do that. In short, the dynamic here is I just think it's too difficult to break down and say it is all mental, it is all this. So it's a keen mix for each different sport, and the makeup, the ingredients of each player is slightly different, with their strengths and weaknesses pushing against each other. And it's just trying to help them to work out, what to do just a little bit better. No, I was going to say, can you spot it in a room? I really don't think so. No. Sorry, I don't think so. You could see people who possibly work harder than others and who pay attention more. Maybe what you can see is attention.
Yeah.
Maybe the steeliness is that focus of attention. They're looking at you and you can see them processing, whereas you can look at others and, we live in a world now where we're open-minded to neurodivergency. ADHD, specific learning challenges that people have. I genuinely do think in my work, when I stand back and I watch coaches speak with players, that you can see some players who they're not present, they're not there, they're not listening. The attention hasn't been grabbed. You've got to hold attention, direct attention, grab attention as a coach. And some players struggle with that. So maybe the indication, the performance indicator, the learning indicator, it's the steeliness. It's they want to learn. And they can learn. And they can learn.
Talk to me about the importance of resilience in athletes.
Oh, look, it's incredibly important. And again, if I was to go full circle, I would say my technique of game face could be very helpful. There's numerous ways to help people be resilient. What is it to be resilient? There's so many different definitions. I tend to think of resilience as the ability, in essence, the ability to stick or twist, the ability to be stickable or adaptable, as in right now in the moment, what do I need to do? Do I need to stick to what I'm doing, or do I need to adapt in the moment? If I have the ability to stick with my focus, to stick with this way of playing, to stick with this mindset, to stick at what I'm doing right now, that's important. That to me is resilient, irrespective of what's going on around me and inside of me. My thoughts, emotions, feelings, the external distractions, I'm going to stick with what I'm doing. And also the ability to adapt when I need to adapt in that moment. I think that's also resilience. I think it's noticing, it's being intelligent, it's noticing what I need to do in the moment. And if right now what I'm doing isn't working, maybe it is having the intellect to be able to adapt in that moment. Is that vital? It is absolutely imperative. And I suppose my answer leads me on to suggest that resilience isn't one-dimensional. It's underpinned multi-dimensionally. Resilience is intelligence. Resilience is mental. Resilience is physical. Resilience is technical. Resilience is tactical. Resilience is all of these things. I can be resilient by knowing the game plan very well, my tactical responsibilities, so that I can remind myself of these when the going gets tough in order to stay resilient. Okay, I can be more resilient by being fitter, stronger. Absolutely. I can be more resilient by working on my technique so that my skills are more robust and more adaptable. So that's a part of it. Game intelligence, if I can see more and process more and shift my attention very quickly, I can be more resilient. So I think we need to be very careful when we think about resilience being a mental quality. It's multidimensional, and there are many things that underpin it.
Interesting. What advice would you give to a young athlete who's trying to excel in the sport?
Many unsurprisingly, many pieces of advice. I think the number one, I always talk to people about the 3 Ps of coaching. So I talk to coaches about 3 Ps of coaching, but you can consider this from a playing perspective. Participation, progression, performance. The participation piece is the engagement piece. Okay. Engagement in sport is really important, especially if you've got high ambition. You're going to be naturally engaged in it because you've got ambition, but you've got to retain that engagement. I burnt out as a golfer because I didn't practice very effectively. I dropped in confidence. I didn't take enough rest and recuperation. I was far too intense about things. People talk about the grind and working really hard, and it was just like I did too much of that, if anything. So you've got to have the right structures, the right schedules, and the right people around you to stay engaged, to retain your sense of participation in your sport for long enough to see how good you can get. The second P is progression. The progression piece is the learning piece. And I would almost argue that this is, engagement is always going to be the most important because I've got to engage in the sport to get good at the sport, but learning is just equally as important because become a great learner. One of the easiest things to do is to work hard in what you're doing, especially your sport. A tougher thing to do is to work intelligently, work effectively, engage in what we might call deliberate practice, practicing on purpose intentionally. Having stretch objectives, being able to build your self-awareness as you play, as you practice, in order to check in with yourself so you can become intelligent about what your game is like, the areas you're trying to improve, etc., etc. So being a great learner, I think, is absolutely imperative. So that's the progression piece. And then the performance piece is the competitiveness piece. And I would always say that young people who are ambitious need simple competitive mental frameworks that enable them to concentrate effectively, retain their sense of confidence, commitment, and sense of self-control, which we spoke about earlier, to take control of the responses that you experience whilst you compete. So participation, progression, performance, engagement, learning, competing. You need good, strong support mechanisms around all of those things.
You touched on something there which obviously can go sport or any walk of life really, which is burnout. How would you identify burnout? If it was you yourself and is there some almost telltale signs that little things that you could potentially pick up on, where you think maybe I am getting to the point where I'm a little bit burnt out here, and I need and also how, if that is the case and any signs are showing, how do you deal with that?
Body language, capacity to pay attention, withdrawal. I think those would be the 4 things that immediately spring to mind. I think you can see it in people's body language. I think you can hear it in the words that they use and the way that they're able to articulate themselves. I think that people can tend to withdraw. By withdraw, I mean to literally, physically stay away from certain things because they're so exhausted, and they're not necessarily staying away to rest and recuperate. They're just staying away because they're exhausted and they just can't get themselves into the position to turn up to work or to turn up to the game. Or so I think those are some of the telltale signs, without a shadow of a doubt. And form as well. I think that's a massive one. If somebody plateaus or slumps in form, that's definitely got to be something that you have to consider. Am I burning out? Am I exhausted here? If you've got a run of poor performances, and when you unpack that, it's somebody who is striving to execute the process, striving to do the right things, but doesn't have the energy to necessarily do them. There's another word, energy. Doesn't have the energy to necessarily do them to the best of their ability. And so form drops off. That's obviously going to be an indicator. And that has implications for coaches in sport, because don't automatically assume something is down to an inability or down to a lack of want. Sometimes it's that players want it too much. Sometimes it's that they're working too hard. Those kind of factors absolutely impact how somebody feels, and so can impact burnout and subsequent performance.
For you personally, obviously you you listen a lot to people's problems, traumas. Is it difficult for you to then almost decompartmentalize and shut yourself off from that? Because I can imagine it's all day, every day you're listening to this. How do you cut off from it?
Yeah, look, it's a really good question. I think the first thing to say is, as a qualified and registered sports psychologist in the UK, my competency goes as high as, I can deal with certain mental health, well-being factors. Most of my work is on the kind of things that we're speaking around on the performance side. So when you say trauma, I would always be very careful about engaging in a relationship with somebody around those kind of things. I have a certain level of competence before I have to pass it on to somebody else. But to answer your question as accurately as I can, I definitely think some people couldn't do it, and it does exhaust. It can tire you out, and you care. Although one has to be very careful about that, because one has to keep a rational distance from the experiences that somebody is talking to you about in front of you. It can be challenging, and like anything in life, sometimes you just don't do it very well, and that's okay. You have to kind of forgive yourself for that, and you find yourself watching a movie on Netflix and maybe reflecting on some of the conversations you've had during the day, and maybe brainstorming other ways to help that person. But that's what it is to be passionate and enthusiastic about your job, is you are often thinking about it during your downtime, and that's how we function as human beings. But really it's recognizing that rest and recuperation is really important, that there is a time to try to, the classic switch the phone off, put things away. We've spoken about this off air and how we might not be very good at doing that kind of stuff, right? I'm not great at it, but and for me, it's more that I'm trying to brainstorm solutions for the teams I'm working with and the players I'm working with, more so than any kind of, clients with traumas or whatever. I'm not a clinical psychologist, but it is trying to say, I think for me, Anthony, if anything, it's recognizing that rest and recuperation is going to help me be ready for tomorrow. And I do have to come away. And it's when I'm almost answering the burnout question here as well. It's when I experience some brain fog, when I just feel physically exhausted. I know that's when my sugars and glucose have been depleted from the front part of my brain, and I can hardly string a sentence together. There you go, I'm starting it now. I can hardly string a sentence together, and then I know I have to turn my attention onto something else.
So this might be a difficult question to answer, and I think you may be able to answer it without naming names. But what would be your biggest highlight in your career where you think, yeah, I've really made a difference there?
I'm proud and pleased to say I've had a few of those. I think this sounds like a random one. I didn't talk about it today in the session because a game face certainly was a part of this. I worked with it's not so much I've made it, it was just wonderfully satisfying. I worked with an esports team. And they played in the biggest esports tournament in the world. The sport that they play is a sport called Dota 2. Don't ask. Yeah. I did it for 2 years. No idea, watching it still, what it's about. I don't work with them anymore, and one of the main reasons they hired me with the first year was, we think we've got a really good team, young team, talented, but mentally we're folding in the big moments, performance anxiety, and we've got the biggest tournament of the year, and it's an $18 million tournament, $18 million tournament. The purse the year before had been $45 million. And for one reason or another, it dropped down a bit, but $18 million tournament. Can you come and help us strive to go as deep into that tournament as possible? And we worked really hard, and I was in contact. We had WhatsApp group stuff, chat, Zooms. I went in person. I went to a tournament in Texas, Poland, and then the tournament was in Singapore, and we won the tournament. And they're all kids really in many respects. I mean, one was in his early 30s, but the rest were mostly early 20s, and they became millionaires. Not overnight, obviously, because they've worked thousands of hours on their game, but they won over $1 million each. And what was satisfying was that I was heavily involved in, between games. They would come off the stage. There was an arena, 14,000 fans there. They would come off the stage. They wanted me to be quite hands-on. They wanted me to say something, alongside the coach. So that was very satisfying because I was really in the mix. Because most of my appointments, you're not in the change room saying anything. You're not next to Pep Guardiola actually giving a speech because that's all. Should it be anathema? I don't know, but it is. The sports site doesn't give a speech, but I actually had that opportunity. So that was really, really good fun. And I insisted that they buy me a beer afterwards as well. Since they were millionaires, they could afford a couple of quid for a Singaporean beer.
Now, on the flip side of that, what would you say is your career low point?
I've had so many.
Really?
It's that cliched answer of, I've had so many failures. I think probably I will mention the club Derby County. I don't think I did. I was with them for a year. We had 4 managers. I think there were moments that I felt I made a difference, and I think there were times worked with some really good people, good people there. I just wasn't I made a decision to do certain things in certain ways. I maybe didn't detach myself enough from the players, and there were various things I should have done which were different. So that was disappointing, and I definitely learned a lot of what not to do, or what I felt would be important to not do in future appointments. So that was low is probably the wrong word. Again, I don't want to sound too motivational guru-esque or pop psychological, but it wasn't a low, it was just a strong learning experience of don't do that again. I was just disappointed at the situation. I was disappointed at myself. I didn't put my best step forward. So I would say that.
Okay, so you work with different athletes all around the world. Do you find that there's maybe a different attitude to sports psychology in different countries?
I think there absolutely is. I think that, I think the most powerful thing is the individual. There's always going to be individuals in different cultures who love sports psychology. You could go to Eastern Europe, you could go to Australasia, you could go to the Middle East, you could go to Africa, you could go to North, South America, and you're going to get some individuals who are really into psychology and think it's really, really important, whether that's performance psychology or mental health or well-being. If we're talking from a cultural perspective, and I want to be careful about not, tarnishing people with sort of a broad brush treatment here, but I would definitely suggest that in sports psychology, we've become quite accomplished with our research and our delivery through a Western lens, very much. And we need to get better at appreciating our language, our tools, our techniques, our voice, the way we describe this stuff, and how we appreciate cultural differences related to attitudes towards psychology and sports psychology, well-being, mental health, and find ways to have really, really good, sophisticated conversations with people who have grown up in cultures who might see talking to psychologists as a weakness, if you like, or might avoid doing that because they feel it might work to their disadvantage, or it might anger people in their family or people who are important to them. So we have to be sensitive to that. We have to have better conversations. We have to have broad-ranging, cultural-specific tools and techniques that help people from different cultures. It's an educational process. It's a listening process, but we have to continue to be better at doing that.
I suppose then with the football in particular, and also boxing taking off in the Middle East, and a lot of Western former players going across there, surely then that will help and aid that conversation and a lot quicker, because they'll want to bring their own people over then, won't they?
Yeah, and I think it leads to better conversations. It means that those conversations marinate in differing viewpoints and lenses of the world, and it's simply asking good questions. It's cutting through the noise, and it's finding the right language in order to help people who aren't acquainted and accustomed with, say, performance psychology, finding the right language, the right behaviours, the right tools for them. For example, today I spoke a lot to the audience about a high-performance mindset. Well, I could sit in front of somebody who hadn't experienced psychology before, and we just start talking about themselves at their best. And I introduce this idea of a high-performance mindset. And I might talk about, well, when you were at your best, tell me about your focus, your confidence. Tell me about your self-management, your thoughts, your feelings. Tell me a bit about that. And what I'm trying to extract from them is what they were doing, what they were experiencing at their best. Yeah. Now, we can take that as a package and label it as a high-performance mindset. And we can start to unpack how we might do that more consistently, what little things that we can do. If somebody pushes back, not to press that, keep pressing on that. But it's just, little examples, little stories, sharing of anecdotes, trying to help people unpack this in as simple and as cultural specific a way as possible. And a prime example could be religion. A high performance mindset could be related to somebody's faith, for example. That can be something that can be utilised to help unpack their own version of their high performance mindset. Now, if somebody's offended by that term related to faith, so you respect that, you don't go there any further.
Yeah.
But some people are more willing to have that kind of conversation.
Okay. Now we're going to move on to the plugging section, right? So, Soccer Smart, Gareth Bale said.
Soccer Tough.
Soccer Tough was the book that changed his life.
Apparently so.
Apparently so.
Apparently so. As I joked today, I don't think it changed his life, but he came out in the press. I didn't even know he'd read the book, but he said, I think it was in a newspaper a couple of years ago, you could go online and Google Soccer Tough, Gareth Bale, and he said, he was asked what book changed your life. He said Soccer Tough by Dan Abraham. So I think that's very nice of him. I don't think it did. I think that hopefully he read it and there was a couple of ideas there that he used and helped. So yeah, Soccer Tough. So I've got 4 books: Soccer Tough 2, which is unsurprisingly the sequel to Soccer Tough. Yeah. See what we were doing there. I wrote those for players. Coaches pick them up, but I wanted to sit down because I felt, as I said, loads of golf books, but no real good soccer books for players to go, okay. And I got permission from some clients at the time, this is going back over a decade ago, to write about some of the work I'd done with them, to try to bring it alive and make it as simple as possible and as practical as possible. So Soccer Tough 2, Soccer Brain, which is for coaches, and Golf Tough, which is for golfers. So I've got 4 books out there.
Nice. And also a very successful podcast of your own, which is Sports Psych.
The Sports Psych Show, which, as I always say, it's good because I have great guests. I'm an average host, but we do deep dives into sports psychology. I interview coaches, I interview academics, players now and again, but very rarely, but mainly coaches, mainly academics. And it does get geeky. We do geek out. Especially with the academics. So sometimes I think probably we get it gets a bit over the top there. But it's worth listening to if you're interested.
I think we touched on this before, so I'm sorry to ask it again, but if you could work with anyone, who would it be?
God, I'll be glad to work with anybody, Anthony. I think I'd like to work with Pep from being part of his coaching team. I think that would be really, really interesting. I would love to work with a few more. I do quite a bit in MMA and boxing and obviously in motorsports. I'd like to do a bit more in tennis again. I've done some in tennis. I'd like to do a bit more in tennis. So it's really difficult. I think Pep really interests me, Pep Guardiola, and I don't think I'll get the opportunity, sadly. Never say never, I suppose, but I think that he is I just think sometimes in a generation somebody comes along and is head and shoulders, and I think I could sit with him. And I think I could come up with psychological terms that he wouldn't know or wouldn't necessarily know that he's using, but he's using a lot of these things. Coming back to that, we talked about David Fairclough and how he spoke today about how he utilised that idea of game face without really knowing it. They do a lot of his stuff without really knowing it, so I think that's a fair thing to say. But I think that he is a unicorn in a land of unicorns, because being a head coach and manager of a club is really tough. And I think what he's done to be able to take, you can say, but he's got all these great players, but the capacity to lead those players, to get them to work together, to play together, is really hard. You're talking about 25 superstars in a room making millions of pounds a year. That's not easy to do. You've got to know your beans and you've got to be pretty good at delivering. So I think that I have a strong I know what it looks like, what he's doing. I would just like to be a part of it.
Yeah. He's always been on the forefront of coaching, really, hasn't he? And he hasn't sort of relied on a certain style. I've found he's had one style and then it's evolved into something else. You know, he had this thing with the way the right backs come into the midfield, and now he's doing it with the centre halves, so actually almost playing sometimes right in front of the strikers, and you just think, you know, it's not. He almost like it's him that drives this whole new technique of football forward, isn't it? Really, and I find that fascinating.
I think the other one would be as a golfer would be Rory McIlroy, who sees a wonderful sports psychologist and a guy called Dr. Bob Rotella, who's regarded as one of the premier sports psychologists, who is no doubt doing a great job with Rory. But there's just something about, there's some things that I watch and there's some things that I listen to that I feel I think I could help there. But he's a great player.
So what's on your bucket list? What's next for you?
What's next? Same. To be honest, just keep pushing on. As we sit here now, it's the end of the football season. I'd love to carry on with Feyenoord if I get the opportunity. It would be the third year. Will obviously be a new head coach who we don't know as we're speaking here right now. We don't know who that's going to be, so I'd love that to happen. I haven't had a position in the Premier League for a couple of years now since lockdown. My last one was AFC Bournemouth, so I'd be very much interested in getting back to that. I desperately need to write another book. I'm in the process of doing it, but I've been talking about being in the process of doing it for years. I find it tough and challenging, so I would love to get that out by the end of the year, and I'm writing it at the moment. So those are the kind of things, just continuing to do these kind of things, and just continuing to push forward. And I'm always pleasantly surprised. I get to wake up in the morning and have emails from people who want to do some work with me, whether they're 13-year-old kids who love the game that they're playing, or parents of kids who want to be more effective parents for their kids, or young ambitious players, or even people who are pretty famous in what they do. You get the opportunity to receive an email, and if they want to move forward, that's always great. So it's collecting a number of sports. I love to work in every sport.
So on that then, what we'll do, we will put your details together. I know Pep is an avid watcher of this podcast, so next time he's watching, I'll make sure your details are on there so we can reach out.
Wow, and his sports psychologist, Dr. David Young, can kind of hunt me down, and I'll blame you for that.
That's fine. That's fine. But no, I'd like to thank you so much, not just for the podcast, but obviously for the time today. It's been inspirational, I must say.
It's been fun.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you. Cheers.
Thanks, mate.
Thanks, Will.